Okay, we are going to look, let me unblank this. We're going to look at C.S. Lewis's Transposition and other addresses, including The Weight of Glory. I mentioned to you last time that we were going to look at these essays before going to Lewis's own work of science fiction. And I chose to put the essays in between the two works that we looked at before this, Frankenstein and The First Men in the Moon, because I wanted to orientate you a little bit towards how Lewis is going to frame his own response to the atheistic science fiction and the premises thereof of both Shelley and Wells. And to do that, I think his essays are entirely helpful. And I recommend all of these essays, actually. Transposition, The Weight of Glory, Membership, Learning in Wartime, and The Inner Ring. They're all useful to reading Lewis's fiction, and I would say, for that matter, on, and this happens to include a Descriptione Temporum, just as an add-in benefit. I would also say his essay on two kinds of equality is useful as well, Lewis's. Because in his discussion of equality, he talks about how equality, and this is I think a direct quote, equality is medicine, not food. And by which he means equality and the appeal to equality, which is so much a part of the modern temperament politically and otherwise. It's part of the French Revolution, it's part of the Russian Revolution, it's even part of the American experience, is to some degree justified insofar as what we have is an abuse of power by an unaccountable governor. In the case of the Americans, George III in England. In the case of France, the King Louis XIV. And in the case of the Russians, different class structure, but again, mostly against the aristocracy, against the king, and against the church there. So there's a revolt against the abuse of authority by those in authority, and the appeal to equality is exactly that. It's medicine against the poison, if you will, of the abuse of power. So there is that sense of equality that we appeal to and we want to confirm and approve of wholeheartedly, because it recognizes something that's extremely important from the vantage point of Christian theology, namely that every human being is made in the image of God. And as image bearers of God, we have a dignity and worth that does not allow those in power to overstep their boundaries. They have to recognize limits on their power and authority. And one of the aspects of Lewis's work and Tolkien's work, for that matter, is that both of them regard the intellectuals and the leaders, the whole class of leaders, whether in politics or in business or in academia, to have a disregard for their own humanity that they share with those that they would govern and allegedly help. And he notes this abuse of power, particularly in the education system. I talked about it at length last semester when we looked at his little work, The Abolition of Man. And he says if what happens when we get rid of the moral sense of human nature, that we share a common moral framework, is that those who have power and authority end up not recognizing the humanity they share with their fellow man, and it makes them conditioners, and they end up treating those that they allegedly help as if they were a different type of species. They treat them like lab rats. So classical conditioning treats human beings just like other animals. You can condition them physically, chemically, environmentally, and so forth, as if everything that we could attribute to human nature were merely biochemical and physical. And so to improve humanity, they then are more coercive and more involved in conditioning. And as I say, Lewis calls them the conditioners, those individuals that regard human nature and education as simply a type of conditioning. He repudiates their project and says that they're missing something. But what I want to suggest here is not only that he does that, I talked about that at length, and I will come back to that because I think we're going to look at the Abolition of Man. But in the middle of the Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, we'll do one class on it. But what he is decrying here is not just the abolition of man, but an appeal to humanity that has a leveling effect. And this is a second type of equality. So the one type of equality asserts the equal dignity of every human being. But equality in itself does not necessarily only act as medicine, it can also act as a poison. And it acts as a poison when it levels everything, every distinction between us, from our sexual nature to our moral attainment, to our striving for excellence, and it will say that everything's the same. So it will seek to acquire equal outcomes for everybody, irrespective of merit, irrespective of the circumstances. Everyone will get an A, or everyone will get an F, if you want to apply it to the classroom. In terms of study, we talk about being given grades, and grades are from the Latin word gradus. These are steps. You have a different step. Well, this is on the top step, that's an A grade. A little step down, that's a B grade. As you go through the grades in school, you go up the steps. As you go up, it literally you are going up. You have a sense of progressing and not just going forward, but upward. And at the end of all that, you graduate. And those things that you're given as a diploma that certifies that is called a degree. And a degree, again, is a step up. So that sense of moving upwards through education is at odds with the leveling tendency of an appeal to equality. That has nothing to do with merit, but rather has to do with an idealized version of equality that I want to suggest to you is associated with what I last time, and actually the time before, called the view from nowhere. It's an idea of equality that has no worldly application. It is just nullifying every difference. And I suggested to you that an obvious application in our day would be the gender identity postulate, that we want to nullify human sexuality as if the differences between male and female were merely arbitrary and were assigned at birth and could be reassigned to a more equal and inclusive notion of human nature. Now, Lewis is going to say, without even imagining gender identity, although it's really interesting in his sci-fi trilogy, he talks about the significance of male and female repeatedly, so much so that Malacandra, the first planet that he meets, Mars, he notes the landscape has certain features. When you go to Paralandra, Venus, associated with the goddess of love, it has different features. And the two together are seen as complementary in some ways, but totally different. And he goes on to say this is not only an aspect of the nature of rational beings, but also it's embedded in the whole created order. This binary structure of masculine and feminine, it's there in our grammar. Whereas the modern leveling tendency wants to neuter all distinctions and reduce them to zeros, to nullify them, and again, of course, to neuter them. And Lewis is further then going to attribute this to a demonic spirit that idealizes the view from nowhere and effectively wants to eradicate humanity. And he'll connect it then to certain scientific ideas, like the Malthusian fear of populations outgrowing the ability of the earth to accommodate the growth in crops and the betterment of humanity, so population starts to grow. Thomas Malthus fears the consequences of this, and so he wants to control the number of people, in particular the number of people that last time we saw H.G. Wells called the surplus population. By the way, it's not just his phrase. Charles Dickens uses the exact same phrase, surplus population. And what they mean by that is people that are in the working classes who might be politically threatening to the aristocracy. The peasants who are improving their lives and, in fact, not only growing older and having more children, but their wealth is growing, and they become a political threat then. So the leveling tendency has two features. One is that it is medicine against the abuse of power. And that's the one they appeal to all the time. And that's the one we all agree with. We all believe, Christians, and I think mostly non-Christians, not all actually, but mostly in the West, when we appeal to equality, we say, yes, of course. A woman is a human being just like a man. She should be equal before the law. Equal rights in that sense. Same with different colors, same with different, all sorts of things. There's an equality. They're equal under the law. They bear the image of God. They needed to be treated with the same dignity and respect. But the other aspect of equality is this tendency to make everything equivalent, to equalize it, to level it, to flatten it. And that tendency is something that Lewis sees as almost intrinsic in the whole modern worldview. And I suggested that last semester when I was reading The Discarded Image. When reading the epilogue, he talks about that. Remember, I talked about the model and I used the cosmological model in particular, talked about the Ptolemaic cosmology. I won't throw it up on the screen again and bore you once again. But the idea that it had a sense of height and also relationship. The planets above, the heavens above them, related to those below it, and they had influence. The word is influence of the spheres on what lies below. And the different degrees and gradations were actually harmonious with what happened on Earth, to the point where music, again, those gradations of the music of the spheres have their corollary in instrumental music, and also in our human nature. When we hear music, we feel certain effects of it. So the high soprano is connected to the low bass voice, and you can hear the four voices in the choir, that, roughly speaking, but the conjunction of them is harmonious, and we can hear that, and we feel and sense beauty in that. And not only beauty, we sense a sense of proportion and order and truth and goodness in that order. And it's very interesting to see how much music plays into this discussion, although Lewis, in The Discarded Image, doesn't even talk about music at all, probably because he's as badly qualified as I am. But having said that, it is important, and the reason he doesn't touch on it is because it's part of the quadrivium, and he says, that's not my area, it's the sciences. But it isn't the sciences come the 19th century. Come the 19th century, they stop reading Boethius's treatise on music and start with romantic theories of music, expressive theories of music. And those are no longer calibrated to a hierarchy, a cosmic hierarchy, and a sense of truth and goodness and justice and beauty, etc. They're no longer calibrated to that. And here's Lewis's comment. I'm going to read directly from The Discarded Image, and I promise you I'm pivoting to this. He says, the change in models that I just talked about did not involve astronomy alone. It involved also, in biology, the change, arguably more important, from a devolutionary to an evolutionary scheme, from a cosmology in which it was axiomatic that all perfect things precede all imperfect things, to one in which it is axiomatic that, quote, the starting point, or the German phrase, the Entwicklungsgrund. Do you want me to write that? Do you want me to write Entwicklungsgrund? No? Please don't, they say. Okay, I will not write it. But it is the developmental basis. So everything is progressive rather than regressive. So it begins, the earlier model begins in a state of perfection, and the Christian explanation is it falls from that because of original sin, because of the fall. And therefore there's a devolution to be found, and there's entropy to be noted in the material order of things. It's an aspect of human nature. Things don't get better and better, they get worse and worse, materially speaking. And scientists can verify this in talking about the growth in diseases in populations, et cetera, et cetera. We can also observe shortening lifespans. Note that one of the key aims of modern science is to extend human life, to demonstrate its conquest of that problem. But anyway, we shift from a devolutionary to an evolutionary scheme, whereby the starting point in the evolutionary scheme has it as axiomatic that, quote, the starting point is always lower than what is developed. And Lewis comments, in an aside almost, the degree of change can be gauged by the fact that primitive is now in most contexts a pejorative term. So when we talk about something being primitive, we mean it is, we speak of it condescendingly. That's bad. Whereas in older Christian speech, and actually just the English language, we talk about the primitive church as the ideal. What happened first is exemplary. We ought to seek to attain and to recover that. And depending on your viewpoint of this, whether you're an evolutionist in your whole worldview or a devolutionist, it will affect your view of education. And so Milton, who I'll talk about in my other class on Thursday morning when we come to his treatise of education, he says, the aim of education is to restore the ruins of our first parents. So it's a recovery project. In other words, it sees the ideal of perfection in the Garden of Eden, and to be educated is simply to recover what was lost in the fall. Whereas modern progressive education sees the past as a low base, and we have progressed onwards and upwards to the point where, as I showed to you, this idea of painting by Caspar David Friedrich, where we get this image of the man at the top, at the summit of the mountain. This is the progressive ideal, looking outwards and seeing no horizon to it, no boundary. This is the sublime perspective. Note that even the face of the man is hidden from us. He's got his back to us. We can see with his perspective. We don't even notice our own human nature in this. We're looking out into the horizon, but we're at the summit of humanity. And with that, they have a certain account of history then, which I'll go into in greater detail when I get to that point in Out of the Silent Planet to discuss that. It'll probably be the second lecture, when they talk about the anthropology of Malacandria, where the Sorns and the Pfiffeltree and the Hrossa came from, etc. And it will be an analogy with that of H.G. Wells, who gave us the anthropology or the social history of the Selenites, how they came about, their differentiation and so forth. So that view, which he talks about in The Discarded Image, as I say, page 220 and onwards, goes on to say that this revolution, this is important to me, was certainly not brought about by the discovery of new facts. When I was a boy, Lewis says, I believed that Darwin discovered evolution, and that the far more general, radical, and even cosmic developmentalism, which till lately dominated all popular thought, was a superstructure raised on the biological theorem. So biology came first, the observation of facts, and then the significance of that to other things. This view has been sufficiently disproved. A.O. Lovejoy, what's it called? Forgotten the name of the work now. Something about being. Oh, the Elizabethan world picture. Or no, that's a different one again. Lovejoy. Anyway, the Great Chain of Being. There it is. Great Chain of Being, A.O. Lovejoy. The statement which I have just quoted about the Entwicklungsgrund was made by Schelling in 1812. So, in other words, it's 50 years before Charles Darwin. In him, in Keats, in Wagner's tetralogy, in Goethe, in Herder, the change, the new point of view has already taken place. Its growth can be traced far further back in Leibniz, Akenside, Kant, Maupertuis, and Diderot. Already in 1786, so before what we call the Romantic period, Robinet believes that in an active principle which overcomes brute matter, and la progression n'est pas finie. In him, for him, as for Bergson or Desjardins, the gates of the future are wide open, just like this picture. It's a wide open. We're at the summit of humanity. We don't need to look to the past because we can't learn from the past, because all learning is higher and higher and above us. And there's no literal basis for what we do henceforward because we're involved in the spiritual science. We're trying to spiritualize humanity away from its primitive beginnings in bodily form. So Lewis is going to talk about that at great length. And that is the fundamental perspective that I think he is talking about in Transposition and other addresses. And to speak of that, Lewis's viewpoint, and what I think it's, I'm going to try and give it like an overview on this rather than engage with the four essays that I recommended here: Transposition, The Weight of Glory, Membership, and The Inner Ring, all of which you should read, but I don't want to just summarize them. I want to talk about what they have in common and why they're significant. And the first essay is a key essay here, because the move towards transposition is to try and, we've got musicians here. What do we mean by to transpose something? What do we mean when we transpose? Yes. Changing from one key to another key. And so you can be in A minor and you can transpose into B minor, right? But you probably keep it into a minor key, right? You're going to and all of the notes that are there are going to be pushed over into it. And so it will have octaves and it will play, but it will be analogous to that and stick with it. Lewis's idea of transposition is exactly like that. Like the phrase itself suggests that he wants to resist the flattening impulse and wants to have us consider the higher aspect of humanity and the purpose of the humanities. If he wants to resist the leveling effect of the humanities, which I've already said has two tendencies: either it levels us to the material, like Richard Dawkins would have us do, to purely genetic things, the selfish gene, it's just material. We're just a material being, just like all the other animals, etc. So it has the leveling effect of reducing us to the mechanical, the material, the chemical, or it does the exact opposite. It reduces us to the spiritual, the purely holy spiritual. So scientists will do one or the other. In the discipline of psychology, they tend to either reduce us to our brains or to our minds, which have no material connection whatsoever. So they either over-materialize us or over-spiritualize us. What they can't do is to conjoin human nature in the way that Christian theology has bequeathed to us. And the classical age, for that matter, quite frankly. Because the classical age also has a strong sense of our moral nature, and hence the Tao, which come modern thought goes. Because again, the idea of the moral law invariably not only has a sense of right and wrong, but of better and worse. In other words, gradations. So here is excellent character, and here is deplorable character, and there are gradations between. So ethics is dependent on that sense of degrees of merit. And the thing that Lewis most used to illustrate this, or best uses to illustrate it, and I think is central to his whole body of work, is the one we talked about last semester, that book called The Four Loves, in which one of the loves was not like the other three. All of them were steps, but the top step had a different character than the three lower steps. Remember to repeat what we said in that class, not exhaustively here, but just the first step was familiar love, that of the family. He called that storge. The second step was friendship, philia. The third step was eros, erotic love, which we perceive to be higher than friendship or family, which is why all great poetry, not all great poetry, but most poetry and most artwork is centered around erotic love, the love between the two sexes. That's the subject of much of Western literature, Western culture. It's about love. But above those, and what norms those and prevents the even erotic love from going wrong, as it does until we have faces, is the highest form of love, which he calls agape love. And that love is totally contrary to the other three insofar as it is connected to grace and has nothing to do with merit. All the others are based on merit to some degree. There's benefit to the one that bestows the love. So the child loves his mother because there's something in it for him. The mother loves the child because there's something in it for her. The friend loves his friend because there's something in it for her. And we love our friends because they deserve to be our friends. And if you treat me badly, you're not my friend anymore. Merit is a part of that judgment. Likewise of our romantic partners. We see something of beauty in that person that deserves our love, and we expect something from that, and so forth. Agape love is the opposite insofar as it doesn't give itself on the basis of merit whatsoever. And again, you can quote scripture on this, and I have. 1 John 3, this is love, not that we love God, but that he first loved us and gave himself as a propitiation for our sins. So the definition of love is contrary to the other loves. This is love, not that we love God. So it has to literally deny that we love God. The tendency that everybody falls into when they have the flattening view of love, which sees, again, even religious affections as something that comes from us. And so my friends will say to me, if they're unbelievers, I just don't have those feelings for God that you do. And so I can't do this. And I don't have your imagination. They tend to extrapolate and think that's an imaginative gift or something like that. And so they just recoil from it and they misunderstand it. That's because it's not to be understood. It's in some sense incomprehensible. The gift of grace in Jesus, represented in the cross, is irrespective of merits. Remember, Jesus dies not for his friends, he dies for sinners. And that's everybody. Everybody is included under that category. But sinners are those that hate God, who have turned their back to God. These characters. God-defiant perspective. It looks wonderful. You will see this image shown in conservative rallies at the golden age. We're going to look forward. I even saw it at a Trump rally, this image and so forth. We're on the mountaintop. We're looking out. We have a better future ahead than we did in the past. And we've climbed the summit of the mountain. We're better. We can do better. Here we are. No, the love that grounds any culture is a love that comes down. And with that, then, I've put this ditty up behind me that I have got from Dante. I haven't got the ditty from Dante, but the concept of this, and if you were with me, and you probably haven't, some of you were with me, but in my Intro to Literary Theory, or the History of Literary Theory, we read this letter from Dante to his patron Can Grande, and he talks about, and this is just an extract from it, about the ways of reading his work. And it's in the 7th segment here. When he's talking about the Divine Comedy, he writes it, and he says, you can read it on 4 levels. You can read it as literal. You can read it as moral. No, literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. Or here. So here he's going to quote a passage from Scripture and then talk about the different ways in which we can apply this manifest. So when Israel came out of Egypt and the house of Jacob from a people of strange speech, Judea became his sanctification, Israel his power. He says, if we inspect the letter, that is the literal sense of this phrase, the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt in the time of Moses is presented to us. So we literally can see the people leave the land of Egypt. That's the literal sense of the text. The allegory is that the people of God represent not just the nation state of Israel back then, but also our people, our redemption wrought by Christ. That's an allegorical application and reading of Exodus. And every Christian reads it that way. It's an extended application. It's an allegorical application. This is a type, if you will. Later, Christians will call it typology as well, but this is a type. The people of God, the rock in the desert. There's all sorts of different types. David is the shepherd king. That's a type of Christ as well. It's an allegory. So you can read it at the literal level. You can read it at the allegorical level. You can read it at the personal application level in terms of morality. So what is that? He suggests if we read it with the moral sense, the conversion of the soul from the grief and misery of sin to the state of grace is presented to us. That's the moral way of reading that text. Finally, the anagogical, and this is the most important one for the purposes of what I'm just talking about right now, for transposition. The anagogical, the departure of the holy soul from the slavery of this corruption to the liberty of eternal glory, is presented to us. And these three latter senses, allegorical, moral, and anagogical, are what he calls mystic senses. And he says, although these mystic senses have each their special denominations, they may all in general be called allegorical, since they differ from the literal and historical, for allegory is derived from alleion in Greek, which means the same as the Latin alienum or diversum. Okay, so note this. This is really interesting. The modern tendency of biblical scholarship to appeal to history, the historical critical method, right, is presented as a more biblical way of looking at the text. But what it does, it gets rid of is, and what it tends to do is flatten all texts so that the original biblical text is just an ancient Near Eastern text, like any other ancient Near Eastern text, is not regarded as the Word of God, a special type of revelation, and it doesn't have any extended further application to today. That is the tendency of modern historical critical scholarship. It has a flattening effect, a leveling effect, a nullifying effect, and above all, a deadening effect that quenches the Holy Spirit. And Lewis, well aware of this tendency and critical of it, in his work Transposition, is going to talk about the need to transpose the literal story that we have into a higher key. So to give an illustration from his own works that we looked at last semester, when he's talking about Narnia, he's talking about it in a sense when the children begin at bomb in World War II Britain, and they're being bombed by the Germans, and they're taken to the country estate. That's the literal level on which things are happening. The bombing is happening. They're transported through the wardrobe into an allegorical world that they call Narnia. They're transported in the allegorical world. And the reason that we can see it's allegorical is because they can learn from that and go back into the literal world and be changed by it. Because it has an effect. It can be put back and forth. Right? So everything they did as kings and queens of Narnia affects the kids when they go back, and they're better children. Because they'd had a spiritual sense of life that was contradicted by their existence in World War II London, where they were being conditioned by the education system to deny all spiritual senses or moral senses as just feelings that we have, subjective in their nature. So they go to the land of Narnia and experience their battles and victories and so forth with the help of Aslan, as we know. And then they apply that personally in their moral nature and how they engage with other people, how they relate to Eustace Scrubb, for instance, that little scunner, or all the other characters that are dislikable. They act differently, and they can note, and it's commented upon how different they are. And so when Eustace himself is transformed and goes back, it's noted by, what's the girl's name now? Drawn a blank in the silver chair. Who? Jill Pole. That he once was like the others and terrible, but he came back and he was very different. Now he changed, transformed. She noticed this. The way he related to everything had transformed. So this was the moral application of that. But the allegorical world is the land of Narnia. But what the Narnia Lewis notes, connoted in the last battle, is that the reason we love the old Narnia is it reminded us of this place towards which we are being driven. The anagogical sense is what you're being driven towards. It's an eschatological sense. The kingdom to come is experienced in these two senses, but this one is, in a sense, far superior. These are anticipations of the real Narnia. And that's what he's talking about when he talks on, interestingly, it's on Whit Sunday, because that's Pentecost, on the transposition to what the gift of tongues entails and so forth. And it's not just powers, as it were, and the glossolalia that comes with this, which he engages with at the outset. But more than that, a notion of sacramentality, which he let me go back to this, because I said I wasn't going to. Don't let me do what I said I'm not going to do. That's typical of me. I'm not going to do that, and then I do it. The whole of this tends towards a view that I said is trying to re-enchant the cosmos. I said that one of the features of modernity is disenchantment, or the leveling effect, or the flattening effect, the appeal to equality that's there not to raise up the lowly, but rather flatten down all distinctions. So there's two ways that you can create equality. You can fight against for the underdog against the abuser, or you can just flatten everybody down and say we're all equal. We'll just crush you all, and we've treated you fairly because we're all treating you equally. Doesn't matter if you've been punched or are the person doing the punching, we're going to treat you the same. And he displayed that in the silver chair, in fact. The bullies were being befriended by the headmaster and given a chat, and eventually he ended up liking the bullies more than the kid that had been bullied. And no justice in that, but equality. It has the leveling effect. So in other words, it condones abuse and facilitates it unwittingly. Very common in Toronto. It's an abusive culture. Crushes merit and abuse equally, and does injustice thereby by not discriminating on the basis of anything like merit. So what has been retrieved then is a sense of enchantment, and with that a sense of sacramentality. Because what the sacrament does, the literal sense of the body and blood of Christ, is the bread and the wine. But it signifies, it symbolizes as I said, the body and blood of Christ. So it has a different sense, a richer sense. And I'm not going to talk about the sacrament per se. I'm going to talk about the sacramental nature of all things. It re-enchants the whole cosmos to say that it can be used for good and just and holy purposes. If it has in mind whither things are tending, where we are going towards, if it has a view of the new heavens and the new earth, or the new Narnia that we see in the last battle, or to use Tolkien's illustration, the white city, the city of Gondor, that luminous city on a hill that has the tree that's growing in the nations and the healing of the nations and the bride and the groom marrying and so forth. That has an eschatological sense at the conclusion of the story, just the same as Lewis's does. So it has a sense of that's being anagogically, it's being driven towards something that seems to be more meaningful than just the marriage of a king and a she-elf. And chiefly, it anticipates, for anybody who is Christian, the marriage of Christ to his bride, the church. The city, the bride, I mean, look at Revelation 21. Just read Revelation 20, 21, so forth. That sense of bride and city are captured there by Tolkien. Clearly in an anagogical, or if you will, an eschatological, but the anagogical sense is it's being driven that way by the story itself. So it's not just a literal story. If you read it on the flat literal level, Tolkien's story is not very interesting. But everyone recognizes that there's more going on in the story. And that is what I'm going to call the sacramental aspect of the fiction. And Lewis's fiction is the same. So there's a lot of work that's been written on this in recent years, by the way. Hans Boersma, Canadian theologian, very good on this. Likewise, Edith Humphrey in the US, and David Brown over in Britain, actually at the University of Durham. Wrote a fair bit on sacramentality and connecting it to creation and to beauty and God's revelation and so forth. A lot of stuff written on that. And let me just summarize the three aspects of Brown's work. Because Brown, I didn't engage with him much while I was in Durham. I regret that now, because I didn't realize what he was really writing on. It's a funny old world that you're surrounded by people who are quite brilliant and could have been transformative if you'd had a conversation, but then didn't. But Brown asserts, so three theses. One, that the content of faith, as well as the experience of faith, are formed and also reformed in a dialectic between two things, revelation and culture. So it's a back and forth and a back and forth and back and forth. Here's the revelation. Divine revelation says this. We read it as a literal account of what happened historically. So what happened in Genesis 1 is a literal account, but it cannot be read purely on a literal level, or it's basically meaningless. It has an allegorical application in certain ways, and a moral application for sure, because Adam and Eve were given the dominion mandate. We have a dominion mandate as well. It continues to be the case. And the dominion mandate has a purpose, which is to create out of the whole of creation a Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is supposed to spread out. We're to make an Eden of the whole world. That's the purpose of it. Eventually, God will fulfill that purpose himself by creating a new heaven and a new earth. But that was the command given to Adam and Eve to begin. Be fruitful, multiply, fill, and subdue the earth. In other words, get to work. So the dialectic that understands and reads Genesis or any of the biblical texts in that way is engaging with revelation and then applying to the culture in which they live. And then it will go back to culture. So it's a continual process. We go back to God's revelation. We apply it to the culture. We see the cultural transformed by that interaction. And then we go back to Scripture for further reformation. And then the motto of the Reformation itself, Semper Reformandum. Always reforming, never stops. So the great fruit of the Reformation did not lie behind us in what happened in the 16th century. It lies ahead of us because the work is still ongoing. It just requires faithful people to believe that God reveals his truth and in his word, and then to apply it to the culture. But that's a process that Brown calls a dialectic, and the outcome of that is what we call the tradition. Lewis is regarded as a traditionalist. T.S. Eliot, who I mentioned in the first lecture, writes tradition and the individual talent as a whole great cloud of witnesses that we are engaging with. They're part of the tradition. What they said, they're part of our contemporaries. What Dante said, what Lewis said, what Milton said, what Augustine said, these are part of the tradition. And so the tradition often appropriates secular images and even images, and sometimes even includes pagan deities and so forth. So Milton will regularly, and certainly allegorical tradition, will appeal to Zeus as a way of referring to God, the highest of the gods. So it will, right? And the Renaissance does that all the time. Anyway, so that's the first aspect of the aesthetics of sacrament that Brown writes. The second is the emotional and imaginative experiences in the life of faith. Now, if we're writing from the secular perspective, we will see Brown, or we will mistake Brown to be saying that what I was taught in university, that the Enlightenment was the age of reason, and the Romantics are the age of imagination or feeling. And in both cases, reason is seen as a detached, abstract, deadening thing, and imagination or feeling is seen as doing the exact opposite. It enlivens, but they are seen as opposed to one another. So the Romantic age is irrational in nature. Then it's chaotic. It does not accept the appeal to reason whatsoever. That's not what Brown means by that. And he says that the affective and imaginative domains as integral aspects of our rationality. Sees both of that. It's an aspect of our rationality, the affective and imaginative domains. And he says that those domains are a legitimate means of knowledge along with the cognitive dimension. That's exactly what Lewis is arguing about in The Discarded Image. So when the educators dismiss our feelings as being merely feelings or only our feelings, they're dismissing aesthetics as having any relevance to human education, and they're also dismissing our moral nature, which is again part of what he calls the chest, our thumos, the spirited element in us. It's dismissing that as having no part in us. And Lewis is saying, and Brown's thesis on the sacramental way of recovering teaching is exactly that. Our emotions and our imaginations are still rational. So it marries the two. So it's not either you're rational or you're emotive. It's not you're either from Mars or you're from Venus, like pop psychology. Men are from Mars and women from Venus. Although Lewis interestingly writes on that and engages, is really interesting. But he sees the two as I would say, complementary. Each requires the other without losing its distinctive character. So, but the application is this: cultural artifacts move people emotionally and enliven the imagination, but we can't understand that without employing our rational intellect. So faith, while being distinct from reason, is not opposed to it. And so culture and revelation are not at odds. That's the, I believe, in order to understand. The medieval, I think it's Anselm. I believe in order that I might understand. So faith and reason dovetail. And finally, the arts and culture provide opportunities for contact with God because they impart something of the grace of God through the anagogy that's driven backwards in that stuff. So grace, or agape love, is imparted aesthetically and experientially. That gives us a sense of the sacramental quality. That's exactly what we get when we read Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, and it's talking about not just Narnia, but what Narnia represents, what we're being driven towards, the true Narnia. And it also refers to what Tolkien is dealing with at the conclusion of The Lord of the Rings. Not quite the conclusion, because as we know in the book, as opposed to the film, the Shire gets scoured and destroyed even after that. So it doesn't end with a happy ending the way the movie does. So these things are there and essential to that. And I find it really interesting that we then can talk about this anagogical sense driving this in the same sense that I talked about here as fulfilling the medieval cosmological view as a devolutionary view. So we're not just trying to go back to the origins. We're going back to the origins, not because they were better, but because they are recovering something higher, not just earlier, but higher. So it's further up and further in. So you go into the past in order to go upwards. It's not backwards. That's the progressivist word. We're going backwards. Oh, we don't want to go backwards. We don't want to be one of those backwards people. We don't want to be like primitives. We really want to be without cell phones and refrigerators and tampons and without cooking implements. Do we want to go back to the pre-electricity age? Do we want that? Whenever there's a call to go backwards, they speak of it in derogatory terms and talk about primitive conditions. And the truth is, actually, in the radical environmental movement, the answer is yes, they do want to go back to all of those things. Live in the state of nature. So they idealize it there. But I'll not observe the contradiction in their ideas here. But when Lewis and Tolkien speak of a time in the past, they do it not to want to go to the past or to stay in the past, but rather to see it as the foundation for the better way to go forward in the future. So as I say, it has a dialectical tendency. We go to the past to recover the past, and then we apply it to the present in order to go further up and further in. Just like he addresses in The Weight of Glory. The Weight of Glory is exactly about that. And I said that The Great Divorce illustrated that as well, which in a strange way people see as a response to, well, he suggested, response to Blake's idea of heaven and hell. And yet it's presented in almost earthly terms, and it depends on how you see life, whether you're going to go towards heaven or whether you're going to love the place you're in and thereby stay in hell. So it has a directional, not rather than flattening, you're either going upwards or you're going downwards, is the suggestion in The Great Divorce. And he presents spirits that are in the very on the very outskirts of heaven that could go further into heaven, and they would rather go back where they were. They can't abide it. But the reason they can't abide it is not because it's less real, but because it's more real, and they don't want reality. Reality is too hard for them. And the reason it's too hard for them is because you cannot want the real Narnia unless you've experienced the grace of God. You have to know the love that's not like our loves, and you can't be stuck with your own sense of love and obsessed with your own loves, like the mother who loves her son and wants her son, and she wants to possess her son, doesn't want him to change, and she's presented as basically a blight to her son's existence. The son really resents his mother's love, and his mother's love, while good, has become disordered because it hasn't observed the nature of true love, which is exemplified here, and thereby she doesn't want anything to do with heaven, because that's what all loves will be like in heaven. They will all be self-giving and no selfishness left in them at all. If there were, there would be no more. We wouldn't have the picture presented to us in Revelation. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. The sea at this point representing a chaotic force opposed to the order of God. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." So the reason why only selfless love, the love that gives for others, is there, because all of the selfish loves are what give us sin, or are expressions of sin, and are products of selfishness, and lead to the abuse of others and ourselves, for that matter. So if we hold on to our own loves and don't accept God's love, then we cannot enter the kingdom. Does that make any sense? So comments or questions? I've thrown a lot at you at this point. I'm going to want to say more, but I want to interrupt myself. Yes.
This is kind of going back a little bit here.
Please do.
But yeah, I was wondering, you brought up two ideas. There's the idea within Eden of the command to multiply to the earth spread. And then I'm wondering how that works in relation to the evolution/evolution model.
We shouldn't.
With the devolution and the evolution model, right? So if you have something, let's say, we take a classical understanding of the evolution model, right? Just try and get back to Eden or back and cover that, right? It goes that I'm wondering how that relates to something like the working to spread the Garden of Eden, because that seems to be a forward-looking model as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that the Garden of Eden is not presented as a static thing. If it were, the view of the garden that you sometimes see in the Renaissance is that of a golden age in which the fruit falls into their mouths. They don't have to work. That's actually the pagan view of the garden. It's not the Garden of Eden, but of an original state of a golden age, is that there's no work, no labor, no war. It's just constant enjoyment. That's the pagan view. The biblical view is that even in the garden, before the fall, labor and productivity and procreativity are commanded as goods. So all of those contradict the pagan view of an ideal world, first of all. But the reason why devolutionary, it's called devolutionary, is because the Garden of Eden is the thing from which everything descends. So it begins, as it were, with the mountain, and what you would have, and Lewis will present this, by the way, in Paralandra, he'll have Adam and Eve on top of a mountain. That's the earthly paradise. He gets that from Dante, by the way. He gets it from Dante's Purgatorio. There's an earthly paradise at the top of human achievement. And our aim is to recover that state through culture, attain the top of Mount Purgatory effectively, even if we don't believe in purgatory, an ideal Edenic state, and recover all of the knowledge that goes with that as if we were scientists, but also recover the character of Adam and Eve before they committed original sin. But the reason that it is, to answer your question, I think that it is that it has these conflicting things is because it's not an ideal that leaves us static to begin with. It's supposed to be something we move towards. So it involves what's called the cultural mandate. So you can call it the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate. I'm happy with either. They have different connotations, really. But when it's called the cultural mandate, you're supposed to take the garden and make it a better garden. So God creates the apple trees, for example, to give an illustration. And we can, to this day, make better apples by grafting one type of apple tree. Probably, I'm using this illustration because it's one that I learned growing up. You take a twig from this apple tree and graft it to another apple tree, and you get a different type of apple that results from that tree. You can do the same thing with livestock. So it then possesses the benefits of both. Now, maybe the outcome of that is the tree doesn't quite work. Well, then you do it again. And so you allowed certain animals to breed with other animals. You married two different crops, and you create a third type of things. The idea in that this is not wrong. You're perfecting what's there. That's part of cultural. That's good. That's agriculture. That's what farmers do. They want better, more nutritious milk, more of it from the cow. They want a better crop yield. They're going to have to, get rid of the weeds. In the Garden of Eden, as Milton portrays it, there are no weeds. But the growth is so fat, so vast, and so quick that they have to prune it, because even pruning it will make it more, will yield better, as you will know from your own gardens. You have to prune. So there's work involved in it, and it's entirely positive then. What devolution suggests, though, is that the general tendency of the created order, and Genesis 1 doesn't tell us this, but Genesis 3 does, after original sin, is that ideal order is gone. And our aim is to try and, through culture, to recover it to some degree, knowing that we cannot do that because God is going to do it. In Revelation 21, he will create a new heavens and a new earth. We're not going to build the Jerusalem as Blake said it. We're not going to create the new Jerusalem, although that poem Jerusalem, which is at the introduction to his prophetic work, Blake, or Milton rather, is the 19th century British desire is to create Jerusalem in this green and pleasant land. And so it's the ideal. You want to create something, and he calls it Jerusalem, an ideal of the past and bring it into the present. I don't know if I answered your question because it has this odd tendency. You want to go back. It is ideal, and yet you don't stick with the ideal. It has this dialectical tendency. You go to the past, you recover what's good, and then you apply it to the fallen world that you actually now live in. Because we don't live in the Garden of Eden as Adam and Eve did, and we will not live in that state before the coming of the new heavens and the new earth. But it is the educational mandate, the cultural mandate, is to do that under God's authority and not under our own authority. That's the sin of Adam and Eve, is they want to do it by disobeying God, not through obedience, but by doing what they think is best, right? Like the sole prohibition, don't eat of this tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. It's an odd prohibition. And theologians comment on it and say that the sole reason for it, I think Milton says this, is simply to have to be able to demonstrate to them that they have a choice to disobey. But there's nothing like they and Adam and Eve, when you read Milton, Eve thinks that there's something poisonous in the apple. She's just going to die. The fruit's going to kill her because she says, if you eat of this, you'll die. She eats of the fruit. I'm not dead. It's not. The serpent was right. It's not. And I feel a spiritual being awakening in me. I know so much better now that the serpent's correct. I think I'm becoming godlike, more and more godlike. That's what Eve says at first. And then Adam does the same, although he sees her and it's like, you've lost it. What have you done? It's not deceived by what she says, but decides to join her because he loves her. Strange choice, in a sense, because he's already showing cognitive signs of the fall in the choice. But anyway, I'll get into that. Milton will get into it, and so will Lewis in Perelandra, by the way. He's going to revisit the Paradise Lost. That's what we have on planet Venus, is the woman and the serpent. No Adam. He's off on another floating island. It's just Lewis, or Ransom rather, that's there, engaging with that original fallen scene. But the reason it's a devolutionary world order is it sees a perfected ideal revealed to us in the past. That's the ideal. We can look backwards to that. It's been revealed what it was like. We can recover that, but we don't get there by going backwards. We get there by looking at the instruction of the past to go upwards. So we go further in to go further up. It's not going back as opposed to going forward. That's the way the progressivist always disparages it. You're going back to primitive things. We want to be more spiritual. We want to be more progressive. Are you opposed to science? Don't you like all of the implements of modern technology? Because what you're suggesting seems to want to go to a time when men abused women and all that sort of stuff, that malarkey. And then the portrait of the caveman, which again is wholly suppositional on their part. If you want to read a very funny exposition of this, read G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. It's really funny and very good, influential in Tolkien and Lewis, both. But he talks about the caveman, which anthropology suggests is the earliest form of human dwelling. We have these cave dwellers where the man drags the woman around by the hair, don't know why, but always dragging her around by the hair, showing the abuse inherent in the primitive age, and we don't want to go back to that way of things. Chesterton notes that we have no evidence whatsoever that the early humans dwelt in caves. Aside from that, there are paintings in caves that have been preserved. So therefore, their fallacious conclusion is that all human beings lived once in caves, not recognizing that if they had any dwellings that were outside of caves, they would have been destroyed by the wind and the weather anyway, and we'd have no trace of them. Just like we see even in cathedrals built out of stone in England, they get worn away by the weather and time. So the supposition that the earliest humans dwelt in caves is actually ridiculous. It casts a certain view of the primitive life. And Lewis is going to be at pains to counter that in portraying when he goes to out of the Silent Planet to Malacandra and sees primitive beings, the Hrossa, for instance, who have what he would say is a very primitive culture, and they're furthermore they're the poets and the singers, and they must be lowest on the totem pole, he assumes. And then when he meets the Sorns, he thinks, these are the philosophers, scientists, they must run everything, because his question is, who's the boss here? It can't be the Hrossa, because the primitive poetic age in terms of anthropology is seen as an early stage of human development. That's when Homer writes his epics. And then we give way to the philosophers and the scientists. And so, of course, they're superior. So when he meets the Sorns, who are rational, he assumes they rule everything, and then he finds out actually they don't. They just have a different function. Compatible, but different. And they each prize the other, even while they don't quite understand one another. It's a portrait for the right relation by the way of the humanities and the in the trivium field and the quadrivium, because the Soroni are versed in the quadrivium, and then the practical beings are the Pfiffeltrigi. They're the architects and the artists that they work with their hands. They are fantastic at practical application. They, in a sense, are between the two. Again, a portrait of culture in an unfallen world. Note that it's an unfallen world. So that's also going back to the way things are. So the whole of Out of the Silent Planet is going back to the Garden of Eden, at least engaging with the idea of an unfallen world and what would it really be like. And let's not assume that the earthly application can be transposed into a foreign world, because look at what H.G. Wells did in his work, right? Because he's doing the same thing. He's making an analogy between the Selenites and the Grand Lunar and the history of the moon and the history of the earth. And when they recount the two, they see that the difference between the Selenites and us is that the Selenites aren't predators towards one another, and they don't commit war and they don't commit atrocities all the time. And when the Grand Lunar finds that out about the earth, he resolves to destroy human life. And H.G. Wells, as a eugenicist, probably has that same tendency, that because this is the ideal. Here's the ideal being, the Grand Lunar. He's got the big brain. We're trying to develop big brains. We're trying to be more and more spiritual. If we are more sufficiently spiritual, we'll realize how depraved humanity is, and we will then try and, through eugenics, remove as much as we possibly can. That is the aim also in the third installment of Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, That Hideous Strength. The ideal is an artificial world. No more trees. We'll cut down the real trees and we'll put up artificial trees. They don't die. They don't die. Why don't they die? Because they were never alive to begin with. But that's the ideal. They cut off a head, and then they have the head speaking. They go to Merlin to try and get magic to bring about this new ideal. They condition all reality. And remember, I said that that hideous strength, it is a sort of a modern day Tower of Babel. So it's man's knowledge on the height of a mountain, looking outwards, trying to dominate the world, and seeing the way to do that is to eradicate all of life. And Lewis puts in it in the third installment, more explicitly than the first two, the demonic powers. Not there in the first, definitely there in the second, and in spades in the third. The demons are everywhere at that point. And Tolkien didn't like it because it was so overtly so, because it's mixing. Tolkien wants to keep us in the literal and the allegorical to some degree, but more in the literal. Doesn't want the intrusion of the spiritual too overtly in the story. It's there in the background. Whereas Lewis's fiction pulls these things much more into the foreground. And that's because, as I say, I think transposition is very much on his mind. He thinks the Holy Spirit and the distinctiveness of the Holy Spirit in human culture needs to be made explicit and manifest to reach a generation that is spiritually inert and dead, and even hostile to anything that isn't flattening. Now, really interesting on this, have you heard of Marshall McLuhan? Canadian famous sociologist. The medium is the message. You've heard that. Medium is the message, or haven't you heard that? Okay. Not all of you have it. Okay. Famous anthropologist. He wrote his doctoral thesis on the trivium in the Catholic work of, I've forgotten, is it Campion? I've forgotten now. I own his work and I should know. But on a Catholic, but recovering on the trivium. And he's a modern communications theory sociologist. He's a Catholic writer. And he is very interested in the interrelatedness and the teleological orientation that is towards a goal towards which we are being driven, and the consummation of the material and the spiritual in the fullness of time as the kingdom, the new heaven and the new earth in things. And he says that in order to do this, we need the idea of a percept. I beg your pardon? That's what I just said. Yes, Marshall McLuhan. The medium is the message. But this work is not the medium is the message, where he's talking about the percept. What he means by the percept is the ability to perceive spiritual truth in ways that sense data, what the literal or the historical will tell us, alone does not see. As if it were just cognitive intellect involved. If it was mere cognition. That's the perspective that Descartes will require. Modern Cartesian science, the scientific method, will see as facts everything literal. Whereas the percept, as opposed to the concept, because Cartesian epistemology is connected with concepts, is shaped by the eternal word, the logos. Really interesting. And you can't, through the use of these three senses, get this one. This is not the fourth application of these three things, just like with the four loves. This one is the presupposition for all the others. And the word made flesh lead to the words that are written in scripture, but it's this interaction that is driven by the word outside the text, beyond human history, that enters human history, that will be the percept that we need to see the spiritual sacramental sense. So it's if you want to, and that this is you can call this an anagogical epistemology. There's a good phrase. It's an epistemology or a theory of knowledge driven by where knowledge tends, which is not only to the future, because that's just the progressive sense, They just think of backwards and forwards, but upwards. The anagogical sense takes us upwards and not just forwards. And we are misunderstanding scripture, I think, in the book of Revelation, if we read the Revelation as merely about that's happening in the future. It doesn't only have that, it does have that sense, because it's not in the present, and we think in terms of space and time, we think in terms of the future, but it also has a sense of upwards. And so in Hebrews 12, it says, you've come to Mount Zion, where everything that can be shaken is being shaken, etc. So the kingdom of God on earth is a kingdom that's in the midst of this kingdom and is an upwards pull of culture, not just a forwards or backwards pull. Again, the idea of going forward or backward is the linear, flattening perspective of the historicism of the Enlightenment. And what Lewis has in mind is the transposition of that frame to a higher key, an upward one. And it requires us to experience the weight of glory that comes down, the heaviness that comes down that pulls us up. Because remember, Christ not only becomes incarnate, he is raised and ascends. Likewise, our culture not only needs to become incarnate, it needs to ascend in its development. And where it descends in terms of a historical image is the Garden of Eden, but you need an imaginative sense to know what the Garden of Eden even entails, which Lewis presents to us in Out of the Silent Planet. We have rational beings in an unfallen world. How do they think about what they do? And how do they regard life? And how do they regard history? How do they regard beings that are different than they do? How do they regard God? How do they regard cosmology? So he's going to put us in their shoes and imaginatively then recreate the vision of Adam and Eve and an unfallen world. So it is an anagogical epistemology that Lewis is presenting us to that pull us upward toward God. That's the intention of it, not just a backward, retroactive, and primitive view. Note that Ransom initially sees them as primitives before learning that he actually thinks like a child and they regard him as somebody that needs to be taught the most rudimentary things, which is humbling to him. So it's not just external and internal, which is what Cartesian dualism posits. There's knowledge that we have outside of ourselves and there's knowledge in, and it doesn't collapse them into the naturalistic framework of materialism. It's contingent on the omnipresence of God in all things. So that's also something that's the final feature, and I'll finish with this, the final feature of Lewis's cosmology, or his fiction, and I would say Tolkien's as well, even though he doesn't even mention God. There's a sense of God's presence in the midst of even the most literal thing. The spiritual senses or mystical senses are in the literal. It's more explicit in Lewis. But in both cases, the presence of God is being manifested in their works. Okay, so I'm done. Fini for now. Out of the Silent Planet next time.